Okay, we'll get started here. Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon which time zone you're in. We're very glad to have you here with us this afternoon. This is Eric Sweden with the National Association of State Chief Information Officers. And this afternoon, we're going to be talking to you about a report that we have published along with a corporate partner of NASCIO, InfoSys Public Services. That report was the product of a set of interviews as well as a formal survey instrument that we submitted to our state CIOs and their staff. So essentially, state CIOs were asked to share their perspectives on the components or criteria necessary to make decisions on the right things. And the survey and the various interviews that we had done were used to gain their perspectives on four major topics integral to IT decision making. And that includes alignment, operating structure, infrastructure and applications, and investment management. We're very glad to have our presenters here with us this afternoon just to introduce them and a little background on their careers. Dr. Orgeron, he is CIO for the state of Mississippi, also past president of NASCIO. He has over 2 decades of information technology experience, starting with his position as an officer in the United States Air Force. He holds a bachelor's degree in MIS, a master's degree, and a doctorate in public policy and administration from Mississippi State University. He is a graduate of a number of institutes, one of which is the John F. Kennedy School of Government Executive Education Series. We're very glad to have you here, Dr. Orgeron. And then Matt Rigney, Senior Principal, InfoSys Public Services. Mr. Rigney has over 30 years experience in IT transformation engagements and development and the delivery of large, complex technological solutions. He has worked with the federal government agencies in the United States and Canada on state health and human services, and has also worked at the county level as well. So welcome, Matt. Tom Jaskowiak, he is also a senior principal with InfoSys Public Services and principal author of our report. So Tom has extensive IT management consulting experience, including leading IT transformation initiatives, and he has executed programs and projects involving also very complex business processes. So we welcome our speakers, and I'll move the slide along here so you could see their faces. So these are our speakers. Matt is at the top, Tom, and then Dr. Orgeron. So with that, we are going to move into just a little bit of logistics here. We ask that you submit your questions, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I'll move the slides as instructed by our speakers as we move along here. So Tom, I will turn it over to you. Please kick us off here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Welcome, everyone. Over the course of the webinar, we will cover several topics, as you can see in the agenda in front of you. I will start by describing the study and highlighting some of the results that we found interesting. The other panelists, Dr. Orgeron and Matt Rigney, will provide some additional insights from their perspective. The presentation will transition eventually to Matt, who will cover what might be termed more practical considerations for managing IT investments, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. But again, please feel free to send your questions via chat to Eric at any point during the webinar. Okay, next slide, Eric. So the theme of the study is on the question of, is state IT working on the right things? We thought it was an important question for at least 2 reasons. One, the demand for IT exceeds the capacity and budgets to accomplish everything. And I think every state probably has to deal with this at some level. And 2, wanted to better understand how the needs of the state as an enterprise are balanced against the needs of individual state agencies. Or more specifically, are strategies, processes, and mechanisms in place to identify common infrastructure and applications that can be shared between the enterprise and agencies, and the degree to which synergy is being realized. Most would agree that this synergy has value. So back to addressing the question, how should each state approach IT investment decisions to ensure the right things are being executed, also redundancy is avoided, and that decisions are consistent with business principles and strategy? So to attempt to answer that question, we conducted a survey, as Eric mentioned, on the important processes and mechanisms necessary to ensure state IT is working on the right things. And we're going to go into the details now. So next slide, Eric. So what makes something the right thing? States can have well-defined decision-making processes and governance structures, but still struggle with making the right decisions. Many of you may have felt that. Well, truth be told, most states have these mechanisms in place. However, oftentimes the proper decision-making criteria is missing or not well understood. A key premise in our study is that it is difficult to come to a right decision unless the criteria for making it exist. For example, when should decisions be made that are in the best interest of the enterprise, and when should they be made in the best interest of individual agencies? Absent some guidelines on that question, it's really tough to make an investment decision. To provide the best feedback to state CIOs, the survey was structured around 4 categories of criteria that, when in place, support informed IT decision-making. The criteria study are not exhaustive, but are certainly very important to decisions on the right things. So let's quickly take a look at these 4 components, which, as you can see from the diagram, either feed or depend on each other in some important way. For example, the alignment component feeds strategy and principles to the operating structure component. Importantly, this provides direction on process standardization and process integration, which helps define the operating model, which then feeds the infrastructure and applications component, where the details of infrastructure and applications take shape and roadmaps or plans are built. All of this is very important criteria that feeds the investment management component that hopefully eventually will lead to decisions on the right things. I think it's really important to note here that most organizations have investment processes in place. But if the decision criteria are weak, or if compliance to that criteria is weak, it will really be difficult to make investment decisions on the right things. So at this point, I should probably emphasize that, that there's much more information in the study. Of course, we're limited to an hour, but I think that brief overview that I just provided for what we will present today. So let's move into the survey results related to the first component, alignment. So regarding alignment, generally, if you look at the survey results, there's good news amongst the findings. But some cause for concern is also warranted. Typically, as we go through these next few slides, the items in green are usually seen as the positive things, and the item in the orange-red is perhaps the cause for concern. So in this particular area of alignment, state CIO survey responses indicate good collaboration with their business counterparts, a strong presence of up-to-date business and IT strategies, and importantly, mechanisms in place to keep strategies current. However, 38% of the CIOs also indicate that a lot of IT decisions do not align with business strategy. So the implication is that a lot of work has been done to plan, but then decisions are often made that run counter to the plan. So perhaps there's a good reason, but if your alignment is suspect, many of the investments made, to get back to our theme, may not be on the right things. How do you improve on it? Well, perhaps it's a matter of leadership. Business and IT leaders must certainly be involved, but does IT just end up taking orders from the business, or does the business abdicate their role to IT for decision making? Those are common reasons. Perhaps it's a matter of enforcing more discipline. Are there consequences for veering from the plan? I'm going to stop there and ask Dr. Orgeron perhaps if he has any insights from his background that he'd like to share on this particular finding.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the things, or a couple things, really jump out to me, and I think as we were going through the study and putting the material together, one, of course, I think speaks to what you had really just mentioned, Tom, which was, relationships matter, right? So there can be alignment there, but I think relationships in the enterprise is exceedingly important. So that's not always something that gets talked about a lot, but it is important to ensure that a good conversation is less than a phone call away to ensure some of this. I was struck, and you noted, the percentages were very high of these processes exist, these mechanisms are in place, and then you have this odd sort of 38%. And a couple of things that jumped out at me was it's potentially very likely that formal processes exist maybe for the larger strategic projects, but there could be a lot of shadow IT or other smaller projects sort of bumping along, and if agencies have some amount of autonomy, that can certainly happen. Smaller projects could be phased or done in such a way that they really don't hit a particular criteria. Maybe the criteria is just dollar amounts, so a 15 or 20 or $30 million project is going to get a lot of attention and a smaller one wouldn't. And I think lastly, what jumped out at me that I think it's both a positive for states, it gets talked about a lot, and it's a challenge, is cloud. Cloud offers tremendous agility, tremendous potential economies of scale for states, but then conversely, it may be very easy for lots of cloud projects to quote-unquote pop up that may jump the track of these more formal alignment processes that you noted. So that's certainly what jumped out at me in terms of the data.
Okay, thank you. I think even though it was a positive, there was one other finding, and 59% of the CIOs stated that the business community knows how to use IT to improve performance. Just based on my experience in benchmarking and in the corporate world, that's a very high number. And so that kind of surprised me. It sounds positive, but it just sounded kind of high. Perhaps it was the way the question was worded. But anyway, let's now move on to operating structure, the next slide. The survey indicates that, again, much work has been done to identify common processes and data that can be shared across the agency. And this is really important as it feeds the definition of the enterprise operating model, which is really the cornerstones for effective IT governance. This can't be emphasized enough as to its importance, because if you don't know how you want to operate, it becomes very difficult to make decisions about investments on the right things. You can see from the green circles here that the level of understanding, awareness of the operating structure is pretty good. Maybe not great, but pretty good. Yet only 21% of the CIOs indicated that this is put into practice, indicating that the instantiation of the operating model is lagging. So why is that? Well, one obvious answer is that the work to instantiate is in process, right? So the definitional work has been done, but not much else. Or it could mean that there are some significant barriers present, such as an overly complex systems environment. In fact, a survey question in a later section implies complexity is prevalent. Or it could be that the state agencies are just not fully convinced that they will benefit from enterprise-wide shared investments when it comes to making investment decisions. So, Dr. Orgeron or Matt, do you have any further thoughts that you'd like to share on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick, and if Matt has something as well. But first off, I think the points you made were spot on. I think that the environment is getting increasingly complex, and I think that complexity makes it much more difficult, which another point I think you made that I see every day, much more difficult to articulate the value proposition. I mean, there was a time when there was only a couple of ways to do something, so leverage and scale mattered a lot more. Um, One of the other thoughts that come to mind recently is similar to a comment I made a minute ago with cloud. We've been told that in some cloud brokering models, the scale just isn't there, that literally some of the common processes or tools have become so commoditized, you could buy 1,000, you could buy 100,000. So that's a real dramatic reversal of how classic CIO organizations have operated. And I think that could possibly play into it. So the findings seem spot on to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's also a reflection of how within agencies and departments how the IT organization probably grew, right? They grew probably heterogeneously, and so it takes a lot of effort now to say we're going to share data and processes when they're already established and running.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Great point. And I think, again, that kind of revolves around that theme of complexity that we'll cover in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So, Eric, let's head on to infrastructure and applications and cover that. So, instantiating the operating model in a systems environment provides a stable foundation to implement the more volatile elements of the strategic plan. So, ideally, elements of the strategic plan, those things that you want to have realized within the next year or certainly a specific time horizon, and by having the ability to leverage a rather stable operating model would be fantastic to allow you to be successful with your strategies. So while not as visible as executing on a new technology-enabled business strategy like, let's say, big data, it represents, the instantiation of an operating model represents a platform that reduces complexity and enables more rapid realization of strategic benefits. Majority of the CIOs indicated that they are in the process of updating or transforming their infrastructure applications, as the green circles show. Not to say that the road mapping effort couldn't be improved some from the 53% it shows. However, the interesting finding is that only 24% of the CIOs indicated they do not have a defined platform of standard business processes as to use as input to the investment decision-making process. Yet, if you remember the last slide, we found that the instantiation of the operating model is lagging. So I think that just like under the operating structure, it could mean that the definition of platforms is just well ahead of the development work that goes into enabling the platform. And perhaps, again, I think complexity is a significant barrier to process. So once you have a lot of things in place, of course, as Matt said, it becomes more difficult to change, whether it's organizationally or even from a system standpoint. So Matt or Dr. Orgeron, I know that this might require more data and more study, or just more time to realize the changes necessary. But would you have anything to add to this particular set of findings?
I think on this one real quick, in some ways it doesn't surprise me because, we've been in the infrastructure business for a long time. In some odd ways, governance is typically somewhat trickier because it can be political and there can be some other concerns. So the fact that, there are standard processes that are out there from a platform perspective, it may be odd that they're not used as much, but I think the fact that they do exist from an infrastructure perspective is, that would be in line from what I would see, because that's been a very traditional sweet spot of expertise for state CIOs for a long while.
Okay. Thank you. Eric, I think we can move on to the next slide, the investment management slide. So generally speaking, I would say IT investment management processes and governance are in place, but consistent execution is really questionable based on the findings that we have here. A couple of points I would make. For those states without up-to-date strategies, well-defined operating models, an infrastructure and application roadmap, and effective business and IT governance, really the criteria of the first three components, for those organizations, making decisions on the right things will be difficult and unlikely. For those states that have those decision-making criteria in place, that's great, but that's not sufficient, as the absence of value discipline reflected in the survey impacts the ability to make decisions on the right things. For example, looking at the leftmost red-orange circle, 64% of CIOs struggle to measure post-project benefits. So if you don't know if you're realizing the value that justified the investment in the first place, perhaps the system could be gamed if you don't keep everybody honest. Or looking at 41% of the CIOs, the last red-orange button, that say they struggle with business case competency. I've seen that in many organizations where some great processes are in place, but there's a lot of inconsistency about how business cases are put into play, and therefore it makes it difficult to make decisions on the right things. Not that everything is based, or every decision should be based on a financial case, but we all know that a financial case will be very important to almost any decision that is made. So finally, we touched on this earlier, and I said we would talk about it a little bit more later, but a telling sign that the path ahead is challenging is reflected by the large number of states, just under 45%, that spend greater than 80% of their budget maintaining existing systems. And just to add more perspective on that, we didn't include the neutral responses in that number. So we only included the agree or strongly agree responses. So you can easily flip this question and look at just the number of CIOs that disagreed or strongly disagreed with this statement, with the statement that 80% of their IT budgets were spent maintaining existing systems, and the percent response was only 24%. So what I infer is that the complexity level of existing systems environments is high and effectively crowds out funding for new initiatives. And I think that, again, may be why we saw the instantiation of the operating model and more platforms not in place in the earlier components. Dr. Orgeron, any comment on that?
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting finding. A couple of thoughts. You make really good points about, and I think that the post-benefit in projects and the cost benefit are also things that I see daily. I wonder if, and I hope this is received okay, but I wonder if just in public sector it's just not as much of a core competency as it may be in other sectors in terms of measuring that value that it's derived. But I think on the maintaining the 80% number, one of the things that strikes me is, modernizing these systems or taking the next step is a very costly venture in today's world. It's certainly more costly than maybe when some of these systems were put in place many times over. In addition, I think states just have these tremendous libraries of systems. We've got one dating back to the late 70s that's still running, mind you, and the legislature has given us funding to begin to look at it. At the same time, states are expected to have mobile strategies and, moving on to the next generation. So that's a gigantic continuum of things that you have to maintain. If you just use the dates of, anything from the late 70s to 2015. So it is a bit of a struggle, and I think you lay on top of that, classic demands in public budgeting, and at least there's some part of the recipe of what you're dealing with from a practitioner standpoint.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I also, Tom, think that just like with whether it's a government or private sector, this part of the budget is just not as focused on, right? You've got your, you're operating your lights on. You figure out what your lights on budget's going to be. It's kind of a fixed value, if you will, year to year, almost, right? And you focus everything on the discretionary spend, right? And I think that's, and I don't know if the survey got into the details, but I wonder if we looked at how much was spent on maintaining existing systems versus building new or new functionality within systems. I sometimes wonder if we're focused based on investment, if we're really focused on the right things.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I obviously would require more study. Sounds like a benchmark to me. And I would say, Dr. Orgeron, your point about perhaps in the private sector, the competency around business case development might be better. In my experience in the private sector, I think it's still very uneven. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I've also seen it improve very dramatically, and that's actually one of the points I would make here is that you can start tomorrow. States can start tomorrow to improve business case competency and to improve their ability to measure benefits realized, because those go hand in glove. And it's a step forward, definitely. Anytime you get information, it helps in the decision-making process. And I think the other thing I would say about any kind of improvement in this area, the investment management area is probably the most visible and understandable of the four components we've studied. And so making those improvements is definitely a step forward and would be a good exercise for any state that's struggling in that area. The complexity challenge, on the other hand, obviously is going to take more work, more study, and is more challenging. I mean, some organizations handle that with strictly a portfolio of spending decree, right? We're not going to spend 80% anymore. We're going to spend 75% and allocate 5% of the budget to develop new projects. What that means, though, is you got to get your arms around the day-to-day stuff and figure out how to prioritize it better, which is not necessarily easy, but required. So anyway, I think now we're going to move on, Eric, to the next slide. So identifying and executing on the right things. This slide is a result of an impromptu poll we took at the mid-year conference. So we had like 10 a list of 10 barriers and a list of 10 enablers that will help you work on the right things or that prevent you from working on the right things. And we asked the audience to rank order the options. And what you see here is how we've lined up the top 5 responses. I think we haven't talked about it. We haven't talked about it really at all. And on the challenge side is just we talk about an operating model and sharing common processes. There's a lot of agency resistance. We learned that was a big issue when we talked to the group, the audience at the mid-year conference. And the other thing that came out very clearly in our discussion there was the need for very strong direction and leadership. I seem to recall one of the CIO interviews where it all starts with alignment. If you don't get alignment right, everything else is much more challenging, which certainly makes a lot of sense. And much of that really depends on the executive level and the leadership. And I'll say it on the business side, we tend to focus on the IT side a lot, but if you look at the criteria, the business needs to be very, very involved, and they need to have a really good understanding on how to use IT to improve performance. It's just critical all the way up to the top. Dr. Orgeron, would you care to comment on anything else that stuck out to you in these results?
No, I think they're spot on. I mean, I think they really tease out and focus on the things to really pay attention to. To me, um, agency resistance, or the flip side of that for a CIO is really putting a lot of effort into creating an environment, that executive direction and leadership component to move the state forward. And then to me, I think just the complexity issue and then just classic budget constraints are really the kind of things from a real workaday perspective that we run into and see a lot. Um, but I think the list is very, very good.
Great. Yeah, budget constraints was not a surprise, I guess, when I heard that. Anyway, so I believe the elements in red in the middle are kind of the focus of some of the remaining discussion, and I'm going to turn the discussion over now to Matt as we head into some of the more practical pieces of information related to the study. Thanks.
All right, great, Tom. Thank you very much. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here just talking about investment management, and one of the things that, as I had kind of mentioned before, when we look at investment management within IT, I think a lot of people get very focused on managing that discretionary spend, right? And I, again, just want to say that we need to manage both, and we'll talk about that, both of those in the next few slides. So these are just some key success factors that we found, that if you have these, it kind of tends to lead to better investment management. I think one of the things that everybody struggles with the most in these factors is the willingness to make trade-offs within and across business areas or agencies, right? It's always a struggle if you're managing your investments within towers, to get the investments aligned with what you want to do in one agency might not be the same as what you want to do in another agency. And I think it's just important to try to bring that up to where you're looking at, across departments, across agencies, so that you're truly investing IT money the best way. I don't know if Tom or Dr. Oregon has anything to add here, or we'll just move on. Let's just move on. Eric, please. So when we talk about investment governance model, a lot of people, there's a lot of different models, so we're not going to go into what's the best governance model. But I think that the thing to really focus on is, are we asking the right questions when we set up that governance model, right? We have to look at things that are mandated, right? And what's being mandated, and how do we deal with that within our investment model? What are the decisions that we need to make? Who's making those decisions? Who implements those decisions, and how are they implemented? And another thing that I didn't put on this slide that we probably should address is, how do we measure all that, right? How do we know that we've actually made the right decisions, by the right people, and we're implementing them in the right way? I think those are also important things to keep in mind when you're looking at an investment governance model. Now, I think we had, Eric, a poll that we were going to launch here to see if this made...
So I'm going to go ahead and open that right now, Matt. So here's the poll, and we'd like all of you to respond to this question. So here's the question. Do you go through a similar set of questions in your investment approval process? So please answer. We'll give you a few minutes here to respond. Okay, so it looks like this is stabilized. We'll go ahead and broadcast these results. It's almost even, Matt. Some
Yep.
do, some don't.
Yeah, and so I don't know if Dr. Orgeron or Tom, if you have any thoughts around, or the curious question to my mind would be, if this isn't what you go through in your investment model, then what are the things that you do? What's different? And I know we can't get into those answers right now, but that would be something that I think maybe could use some further follow-up.
Yeah, this is Craig, Matt, real quickly. I think the questions are appropriate. I think that I bet you they're answered by a diffuse set of folks, and those folks may not all be in sync. So, I mean, I think the questions absolutely are asked. I don't know that they're asked in a way that are always, I guess I'll use aligned, which is part of the buzz. In a way that the results
Right.
are shared and it's relevant is what I would say. But I think those are the right ones.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if you're not asking these questions, you need to, because, I mean, some of them they're pretty straightforward, but they require very consistent answers across the enterprise in order to get governance right. So very important.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's move on, Eric. So the other thing I wanted to talk about here is the idea of value leakage. And a lot of times we look at, again, when we're looking at discretionary spend, we'll do a business case, we'll see all this planned value, and then through the program life cycle, we end up actually getting much less value than we thought we were going to get. And some of those things are self-evident, like the business case might have had omissions in it, might have been done well. There's suboptimal customization decisions being made along the way. But I think one of the things that it strikes me is a lot of times organizations design mostly to functional rather than value criteria. And by that, I'll give an example of an agency that I'm working with currently. The business case was all around how to better assess fees and collect fees from citizens in one specific area. But when we sat down and started doing the requirements and designing the system changes, the modifications, you look back at it, and 80% of our requirements had to do with putting in functionality that wasn't actually anywhere aligned with assessing or collecting fees. Things like people wanted reports, and they wanted the same report to be sorted umpteen different ways. They wanted to be able to filter things, and the value that brought after all the development was said and done really didn't come out, right? It didn't have anything to do with assessing fees better or collecting fees better. It was more just kind of a functional nice to have that kept popping up. And so I think that's one thing that we can look at, when we're going through and doing modification designs or new enhancements or new system design, especially, is to come back and ask that question. Are we, do these requirements truly help us bring that business value, that we're seeking? And I think often, just in retrospect, when we look back at that, we could have eliminated probably a good, at least half, if not closer to 60 or 70% of the functional requirements that were laid out, especially when we got into the details of those. We could have eliminated those and still, provided the return on investment, and probably better return on investment, because the program itself would have just been so much less expensive to implement. Any thoughts on that, Craig or Tom?
Yeah, I like this slide. I tend to see this a lot. One thought I had too, I guess from a practitioner's perspective, is there's just so many sometimes stakeholders that, and I hate to use the C word, which is control, but that you don't necessarily have control over. And I see a lot of value leakage in that. You know, you sort of kind of become, and it's sort of Matt, the one you use, right? It's a version of making a bit of a concession. You know, in your case, we added these requirements, we added this functionality, we sorted these reports 50 different ways. Did we need to do that? Sometimes that there's too many hands in the cookie jar in terms of how to move something forward, and I think that really, in my opinion, enables a whole lot of leakage from that plan value part to where you end up. We see that a whole lot.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would
and
tend to
also,
agree. Oh, go. I'm sorry.
so I was just going to comment on that too. The other thing I think we need to be more consistent at and more diligent at is, we do that business case, we decide to spend the money, but then as we're going through the life cycle and we're doing requirements and design, I don't think that sometimes we don't have the necessary governance checkpoints in there to come back and say, okay, are we really designing to that business case, right? Or are we starting to throw in, the fluff that we don't necessarily need?
That was about where I was going. I think accountability is loosely defined too many times, and in fact, I hear it all the time. IT measuring the benefits of a project, whereas really the business community should be accountable for those results. And once they understand that accountability, I mean, I've seen that happen quite a bit, they come to the requirement session diligently. Governance checkpoints you just talked about, Matt, they need to make decisions on, are we getting the value, or, project, are we heading in the right direction? We've always done it this way, or we have to put this functionality in the system. Mm-hmm. So those are all, I mean, the list could be much longer. So.
Yeah. All right. So now we're going to transition, but we're going to talk about, up until this point, we've kind of talked about investment management, the process around investment management. And the other part, mostly around discretionary spend at this point. Now we're going to get into just a couple of things that we can look at, a couple of ways to look at how can you better manage that lights on budget or the non-discretionary spend. And one of the things that, and we talked about several places in this presentation, we had mentioned that the complexity of systems has to do with a lot of that spend going on, right? Especially, the 80% of spend in maintenance. And the difficulty of sharing data and sharing information, a lot of that was driven by complexity of systems as well. So one of the ways that you can kind of take a look at it, and this is just one way. So one of the things that I have found is when I go in, whether it's within public sector or private sector, one of the hard sells is, we need to rationalize our application portfolio. We need to reduce costs in that 80% area because, frankly, nobody wants to talk about it. So one of the things that I found was fairly useful was if I could produce a bubble chart like this where I showed, the business fit, the technical fit, and then we could kind of focus and say, okay, and I apologize, it's hard to read on this slide, but, lower left, document management, we spend a lot of money on the size of the bubble being the amount we spend, right? So we're spending a lot of money on document management, but it doesn't fit the business, and it doesn't fit our technology direction and strategy. So, that's something that we could say, all right, let's focus on that. Let's not focus on everything, but let's focus on one thing at a time and see what we can do, and a lot of times it's better to do it tactically and incrementally than just saying we're going to replace our document management system. Sometimes that's what you need to do is just replace it. But a lot of times you can reduce that spend in that area if you look at it from a tactical standpoint as well, without taking on the big bang replacement. Any thoughts on any of that? No. All right. Let's move on. We've only got, I think, another slide here, and this is just another means that I have used in the past to try to get people to understand, why we need to focus on these types of things, right? So again, it's just business technical, and economic. And we just use a sliding scale based on benchmarking statistics, and then, our assessment recommendations. And as you can see, again, we're looking at an e-commerce solution in this case, but it's not fitting the business benefit. Economics are good in this case. We're not spending a lot of money on it, but it's not providing any value either. So, that's the other thing that you can focus on when you're looking at, rationalizing the applications is let's look at the ones that we're spending a lot of money on that aren't providing any value. And even if we're not spending a lot of money on it, if they're not providing business value, those are the things that I think you really need to focus on. And those usually are the ones that the business will sign off on, right? Because they're, you point out that, yeah, this isn't fitting what you need, so let's do something about it. So a lot of times they're more willing to go ahead and provide some budget to do that. And again, the budget that they provide then becomes discretionary budget. So, any other thoughts on these?
I've used something like this in the past, and it's worked very well. It's a great communication vehicle.
Yeah, so we can move on, I believe, Eric.
So with that, we can move into some of the questions. Final comments there, Matt?
No, I was just going to say, you take it away.
Okay, well, we will start looking at some of the questions, and one of the first questions we have, go back to this slide here, which is on investment management. So the question is, the slide presents 71% of CIOs prioritize projects based on projects' prospective value. So the question coming is, how is or should value be measured? And this may be a question more directed at Dr. Orgeron. We'll ask that question, but how should it be measured? And what are current or ideal metrics that CIOs could use? And any insight into that? So Craig, how should value be measured as you look at that 71%?
Yeah, one thing we talk about a lot, we were actually meeting with some of our legislative advisors today. We sort of, especially in that context, we want to sort of differentiate, right? So in private sector, many times value could be measured in, is it going to increase my competitiveness? Am I going to be able to capture more market share and grow my business? The public sector is, of course, not profit-driven. So many times the metric is the opposite. Does this make us more efficient? Can we spend less money, right? So it's always about, spending less or spending what you need to optimize. So there's a lot of the metrics that we see are sort of enabling metrics, right? Government's not out to increase market share. So typically it's going to make us more efficient. Folks are going to work remotely. It's going to enable, web-based architectures so that, we can share common platforms. It's typically always cast in a less. We're going to be able to spend less when we do this, and it makes the state better. That is typically the value perspective that we see. We want to change that a little bit, right? So we don't want to make public sector profit motive oriented. However, we also want to pitch the value of technology as much more progressive and enabling. Technology is going to enable us to do government better, to do our jobs better, and bring some measurement to what that means. Seeing more clients, building more roads, all the different things that government does. So at a very high level, that's sort of that, differentiation that you typically put forward. It's a very different conversation from my private sector time to my government time where, you're going to put money into quote-unquote, a system, and that investment's going to make you more competitive and drive you forward. So the public sector is typically different, right? What do states talk about when they rationalize platforms, which is in one of our slides, or consolidate? It's what you saved, right? You rarely hear states talking about it differently. So that's typically the mantra is, what I would say.
Very good. Matt, any reaction to that question on your part?
Well, I think Craig is right, but I think it also depends. I mean, I don't think there is a one answer for that question, right? Because I think a lot of it goes back to what's the business case. If the business case says that we're going to be able to process something quicker, we're going to we can a customer service representative can handle more calls, can take on more clients, can do whatever. Those are the things that you would measure, right? So I don't know that there's one answer for that, and I don't know that there's one set of here's the metrics that you need, right? Again, I think it all depends on the situation and the what are you trying to accomplish.
Very good. Tom, any comments from you, sir?
Yeah, I agree. Each individual project can be somewhat subjective in terms of the value you're trying to achieve. And I've seen financial consideration will always be important, but customer satisfaction or resident satisfaction might be something that doesn't relate to a financial metric, although there are ways to do that depending on how sophisticated you want to be. The only thing I would advise is don't try to measure 30 metrics. 3 or 4 would be great. Just get them right.
Agreed.
Very good. I'd like to move on to another slide here, and that is the one on governance. We've got another question coming in that presents any comments on the involvement of state legislatures on IT project governance or other high-level IT decisions. As you look at these questions that are presented on the slide here, Dr. Orgeron, any insights on from your perspectives on where that involvement really comes into play and how much involvement there is relative to legislative participation in the decision-making process on the investments, on the governance, on the where are you going to put those few resources that you have?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've looked at some governance models from different states, and there's certainly different approaches. I mean, there are some where either legislators or elected officials sit on an investment board of a sort and play a pretty significant role. I would say at a minimum, of course, the legislative branch is the appropriating branch, and so whether someone's part of a formal, yes or no, clearly they're going to be appropriating dollars. So I think by default, programmatically, they're blessing investments to move forward. I'll get a little fuzzy on you and say trust and relationships mean a whole lot. They've got to really trust that when you're over there asking for a lot, that you've done your homework and it's going to get done. My experience specifically with legislators has typically been good. They are smart people. They're typically very successful in their business before they ran for office. They know what they're doing. They don't get too far into the details. So I think it was either Tom or Matt made a comment about the metrics. So if you're proposing a project, you really want to be very focused. You don't want 4 pages of percent this and percent that. I mean, you want to keep it, pretty focused because typically you do not have a whole lot of time. But yeah, I would say they're going to be involved by default, right? Because they're the folks approving the budget, and those are the folks that you're going to be talking to. So I think by default, they're part of the process.
Very good. Matt, in your experience working with government, what could you add to this question, please?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways that I think the legislature is involved. I think they're definitely involved in the question is what is mandated, right? Because they'll mandate changes, within laws or whatever, and there's no choice but IT having to implement those changes, right? And then I also think that they get involved in kind of who's making each decision, right? How high are the decisions need to go, and do they need to go in front of the legislature, or has the legislature kind of delegated decision making down into to a particular individual within that agency, right? But I definitely think the biggest area that I see is in mandatory, and it's just like in private sector, right? You get regulations coming down from a lot of regulatory issues, and a lot of times you have to do them. I think in private sector you might have the ability to say, no, we're not going to do it, and we're just going to accept the fine. I worked for a bank one time that did that often. Every time the SEC said this is the new regulation, they'd look at it and say, well, if we do it, it's going to cost us $10 million to implement. If we don't do it, it's going to cost us $2 million fine. We aren't going to do it. So I don't think in government you have that option. So legislation definitely mandates things.
Very good. I've got another question here. Tom, I'm going to direct this to you after just kind of a short reminder. The question goes, as IT organizational operating models across the nation are not uniform, was any work done to evaluate the survey results from states that have centralized or consolidated IT versus those that are decentralized IT organizationally in terms of their operating models? And Tom, as you recall, when we did the interviews at our conferences, we came across this concept of, are we an enterprise or are we a holding company? You remember that discussion?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I do. In fact, so the question to me, or what we studied, was not so much about the IT operating model as the business operating model. So where we identify common processes and standardized processes and standardized data, which would enable integration. So getting that picture in play is what's really important. And I think the IT operating model would probably follow from that. Whether or not you have a stronger centralized IT organization might depend on what the business operating model looks like, and vice versa. If it's very, if it's agency-centric as opposed to enterprise-centric, then agencies probably have, more control over their IT than in a centralized enterprise business model situation. So yeah, in fact, the whole concept of many of the states were struggling with. In fact, it was our first interview that we did together, Eric, at last year's annual conference. We asked, very simple question: do you think you're working on the right things? And the response was, well, it depends on if we're an enterprise or a collection of agencies. And I think a lot of state organizations struggle with that. And the response really is, that's really important to understand and to solidify, and kind of related back to the previous question, how the state is organized might the state might be organized in a way to conduct their business. And I think I'll stop there. I don't know if Craig has anything to add to that.
Couldn't agree more.
Very good. Hey, we've got one more question here we'll try to address, and I'm going to move us back to this slide here. And you spoke to it a little bit, but let's go ahead and deal with it head on. Here's the question: what is the appropriate role of the state CIO versus the business program area system owner for benefits realization tracking over the long term? It could be a collaborative role. It's a shared responsibility. It speaks to governance as well. But let me ask Craig, as you look at that question in this slide, the appropriate role of the state CIO versus that business program area relative to benefits realization and tracking. What do you think those, go ahead.
Well, I think that's a super great question. I mean, in my mind, and I may be too black and white, I think the CIO would need to be pushing the shared components. I mean, just like we've talked about, right? So shared infrastructure, shared cloud, shared network, as much as you can do to drive not necessarily cost out, but share the cost across the enterprise. I would also argue, at least in my world, programmatically, the business and the benefits of it are owned by the agency. So if it's an application of whatever sort, clearly outcomes that are achieved, I think, is owned by the organization. I mean, that would be my quick assessment.
Very good. Any additional response, Matt, from you?
Well, I think it's a shared, right? I believe the question, if I understood correctly, was what's the responsibility of the CIO versus the business owner of the application on measuring value, right?
Right.
And I think it's a shared responsibility. I think the business needs to come up with, well, what are those measurements? What is it that we're going to claim success on, right? So if it's better throughput on serving citizens, or if in the case that I was talking about, better assessment of fees and assessing fees more accurately, they have to understand, that has to be identified by the business, what it is that means success. A lot of times then implementing or make sure that we've got the means to actually collect the data that we need to line up against those success factors. I think that a lot of times falls within the responsibility of the CIO.
Very good. And we are past the hour. We're going to bring this to a close. I just want to go across our panel here. First of all, thank you all so very much for presenting this morning and this afternoon, depending on time zone. But any final comments? Dr. Orgeron, let's start with you. Any parting comments as we bring this event to a close?
Well, first I wanted to say thanks to everybody. I've enjoyed the whole way through the process, the writing of the report, our mid-year, and of course this webinar. I would say that one quick comment, when we talked about the value leakage slide, which is one of the ones I liked, if there is further work to be done at a more detailed level, I think that's very, very telling. I think it may get to the problem in kind of a way that you don't necessarily expect, and I think that would be interesting. But thanks to all, thoroughly enjoyed it.
Very good. Tom, this has been a long journey for you. Any parting comments, please?
Well, Eric, I'd like to thank you and NASCIO for allowing us to participate on this study. It was a great learning experience and a great journey. You're right. We've spent a lot of time on it over the last several months, and I'm very happy that it turned out the way it did. And I think hopefully everybody learns a lot. And let's do another one.
Thank you, Tom. Matt, any final comments, please?
No, just I'd like to thank you and NASCIO for all your support and stuff you've done. I'd like to thank everybody that's participated in this. I think it's been a good thing. I think the thing that I would like to see coming out of this, and I think there's certain areas where a deeper dive is definitely called for, right, to really understand, the situation better. And I think that's what I think, I'd like to see focused on coming out.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I'll make a few final comments. This event will be published on our website as well as on YouTube, so it will be available for future reference. And then I also want to direct everyone to our website, NASCIO.org, and under publications you will find the report. It's at the top of the list right now, and we welcome you to download that report, and if you've got comments, you can send your comments to either myself or Matt or Dr. Orgeron. Here's our contact information. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining our call this afternoon, and we will close the call. Have a good afternoon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.